One. One. Okay. Hear me. Just about ready to cuss at my system. Hear me. Just about ready to cuss. So, all right. We're here. We are ready. Ready as we'll ever be. And it is chapter 4 of The Temple and the Lodge, which is the disappearance of the Templar fleet. So, yeah. All right. Everything's working. We've got captions. Wow. How did I get so prepared tonight? Don't get used to it. All right. The disappearance of the Templar fleet. Edward II was at first loath to act at all against the Templars in his domains. When external pressures exerted by Philip of France, by the Inquisition, and by the Pope, at last compelled him to act, he acted sluggishly. The comparative apathy with which the Templars were persecuted in England prevailed in Scotland and Ireland as well. In Ireland, the Templars owned at least 16 properties, of which a minimum of 6 were full preceptories. They were also known to have owned at least 4 castles and probably another 7. By our estimates, to administer and garrison such holdings would have necessitated a minimum presence of at least 90 men, of whom some 36 would have been militarily active. On 3 February 1308, nearly 4 months after the first arrests in France, and a month and a half after the first in England, arrests began in Ireland. Altogether, some 30 members of the order were apprehended and taken to Dublin, approximately 1/3 of the total strength. There does not appear to have been any particular brutality in Ireland. Certainly there were no burnings, no executions. The Master of Ireland was released on bail, and his subordinates are believed to have been treated with comparable leniency. There is no record of any Irish Templars having been sent to monasteries to do penance. In Ireland, then, by 1314, virtually the full strength of the order would have been at large, some having escaped the initial arrests, some having been released after interrogation. Given the prolonged delay before action was taken against them, the Irish Templars would have had ample time and opportunity to make provisions. They clearly seem to have done so. When their lands were seized and their possessions inventoried, virtually no weapons were found. According to one historian, it is extremely surprising to find the abodes of a military order so poorly equipped with arms. In the main house at Clontarf, there were only 3 swords. At Kilclogan, there were only 2 lances, an iron helm, and a bow, and yet, with Edward II complaining at this time about Irish arms finding their way to Scotland, there was certainly no shortage of equipment in the country. It would thus seem evident that most Irish Templars not only escaped arrest, but did so with the bulk of their weaponry and equipment. Templar refugees. On 6 October 1309, a full 2 years after the first arrests in France, Edward ordered his officers to arrest all the Templars in Scotland who are still at large, and keep them in safe custody. In fact, only 2 were ever arrested, although one of them was the Master of Scotland, Walter de Clifton. But by 1309, Edward was in no position to enforce his decrees in Scotland, most of the country then being in Bruce's hands. In March of that year, Bruce had been declared ruler by right of blood, and with the consent of the said people he was chosen to be king. At the time of Edward's decree, he was fighting in Argyll. By the end of the year, he would have 2/3 of Scotland under his control, and the English garrisons at Perth, Dundee, and Banff would have to be supplied by sea. Embroiled in his own guerrilla war against Edward, Bruce was hardly going to honor the English king's edicts, nor having been excommunicated was he going to honor the popes, which, as we have seen, would not have been applicable in Scotland anyway. In the circumstances, Bruce would only have welcomed an influx of fugitives who were also professional fighting men, and they would have been only too ready to respond by aligning themselves with his cause. There is no record of what befell the two Templars arrested in Scotland. Probably they were set free. Under interrogation, however, they testified that a number of their colleagues, including the preceptor of Ballantradoch, threw off their habits and fled across the sea. On the other hand, the trial of the Templars in Scotland was conducted by none other than Bishop Lamberton of St. Andrews. Lamberton, as we have seen, was dexterously playing a complex double game, but his primary allegiances lay with Bruce. He was perfectly capable of acting as a recruiting officer for the person who he recognized as his country's rightful king. Fugitive Templars may indeed have escaped by sea, but they could just as readily have sailed up and around Scotland to join Bruce's army in Argyle. Nor need they necessarily have fled by sea at all. It need not have been just Templars from Scotland who swelled Bruce's ranks. There were also, as we have seen, a sizable number of knights at large in England who had escaped arrest. They had to go somewhere. It is certainly reasonable to suppose that at least some of them found their way to Scotland, and reasonable to suppose that some of the Irish brethren did as well. Indeed, one English Templar, at his interrogation, declared explicitly that his colleagues had fled to Scotland. The question really is not whether English Templars sought a haven in the north, but how many of them did so. Whatever the number, which could have been as high as 93, it was in all probability augmented by fugitives from France and elsewhere on the continent. As we have seen, the Templars in France had sufficient advance warning of the attack upon them to make at least some provisions. Thus the treasure of the Paris Preceptory disappeared, as did a number of the order's high-ranking French dignitaries, who supposedly sailed away on 18 ships. That the Grand Master and other officials remained does not mean they were unprepared or caught off guard. It merely suggests that they had, until the last moment, every hope of averting the fate that eventually overtook them. Every hope, that is, of defending the order against the accusations leveled against it, and of restoring it to the status it had previously enjoyed. It must be remembered that while Philippe's initial onslaught against the Templars in France was swift and sudden, the process that followed was prolonged. There were to be 5 years of legal wrangling, negotiation, intrigue, horse trading, and general dithering before the order was officially dissolved, and 7 years before Jacques de Molay was executed. During the whole of this time, large numbers of Templars remained free, wandering about Europe. They had abundant opportunity to make plans, coordinate their efforts, organize escape routes, and find a refuge. According to extant charters, there were at the minimum 556 full Templar preceptories in France and countless smaller holdings as well. And the order's numerical strength in the country was at least 3,200, of whom an estimated 350 were knights and 930 sergeants, a total of 1,280 fighting men. During the legal proceedings in France, Inquisition records revealed 620 Templars to have been arrested. If the same percentages apply, about 250 would have been fighting men. This leaves a minimum of 1,030 active military members of the order still at large. Templars who were never arrested, never caught, never found. A fair number, of course, would have remained in France, although the account is almost certainly exaggerated. The hills around Lyon were at one point alleged to conceal more than 1,500 refugee Templars, a sobering prospect for both the Inquisitors and the French king, but if many Templars remained in France, a sizable number would have sought refuge abroad. Shortly after the initial arrests, for example, Imbert Blanc, master of Auvergne, is known to have come to England, uh, apparently to advise English brethren on how to conduct themselves during the impending legal proceedings. Eventually, Imbert was imprisoned in England, but under considerably more relaxed conditions than those his colleagues endured in France. In April 1313 he was sent from the Tower of London to the Archbishop of Canterbury for penance. A month later he was granted a pension for his support by Edward II. There must have been many Templars who, like Imbert, came to England but were never detained at all. Some would have come directly across the Channel. A number, in all likelihood, would have come through Flanders, which remained sympathetic to them and maintained constant maritime traffic with the British Isles. As England during the next 7 years became increasingly unsuitable as a refuge, the fugitives from the continent, together with their English and Irish brethren, would have gravitated northwards, where beyond the reach of both papacy and Inquisition they could expect immunity. Um, the Templar fleet and its escape routes. But before I get to that, there is a picture here. In fact, we've got several pictures. I'll go ahead and show them and then go back and start that next section. So the first one says Kilmurray, undated gravestone. Above the warrior's head is a Masonic set square. Below is a Templar-style cross forming part of the carved pattern. So we'll show you that first. I'll have to scan up and down it here. Okay. So above his head is the set square, which is immediately above his head. I don't think they're talking about this very top part. I think they're talking about that angled Tetris looking piece there. And then down here, there's the cross, part of the carving. And you can't really see these others on the sides very well. They're not incomplete. You can see the sword there, though. We've read about them in other ones. I like that Celtic knotwork, too. All right. Next, we have above left the Templar Tower, Church, and Preceptory buildings of Garway, Herefordshire, near the Welsh border. It was passed to the Order of St. John in the early 14th century. So that is this one. There we go. Like to see something more up close on that. Templar Cross, Garway. Originally it stood on a plinth outside the church. And that is this little one here. Okay. 10 is Anonymous Templar gravestone bearing a sword found at Garway. It was used as a lintel during the rebuilding of the church in the early 14th century. And that is that dotted outline of a sword carved into it. And finally, Garway, figure of the Celtic vegetation god, the Green Man, inside the church, which is there. Okay. And then we've got two more pictures. I know some of you might not give a crap about the pictures, but others might, so I'm going to show them. So this one is Garway, showing the foundations of the original circular Templar church demolished by the Order of St. John, which built a conventional rectangular structure in its place. That is this one. You can see that round part of the foundation still there. And Bristol Temple Church, showing the foundations of a circular church of the Templars, which was also demolished by the Order of St. John in the 14th century and was rebuilt in more conventional style. So that is this one. Oh, I'll have to back up. There we go. See the whole thing. All right, so going back to that first part of this section, the Templar fleet and its escape routes. Any mass exodus of knights, especially if it included the Order's treasure as well, would almost certainly have involved the Templar fleet. That fleet which vanished so mysteriously and about which so little is known. Indeed, the Templar fleet may hold the answers to many of the questions surrounding the last days of the Order. It may also point to a possible Templar presence in Argyll. This is virtually unexplored territory. By the mid-13th century, the Templar's fleet had become not just a necessity but a major asset. For the Templars, as for their kindred order, the Knights of St. John, it was much cheaper to transport men, horses, and material to the Holy Land by their own ships than to hire vessels from local merchants. Moreover, the fleet could be used to transport other personnel and equipment, as well as pilgrims, and this proved a lucrative source of revenue. At one point, the Templars were carrying 6,000 pilgrims a year to Palestine from their ports in Spain, France, and Italy. Their ships were generally preferred to others because they traveled with an escort of armed galleys. Then, too, the order could be trusted not to sell their passengers into slavery at Muslim ports, as did certain merchants. And being exempt from custom dues, the temple's ships also trafficked extensively in such commodities as fabrics, spices, dyes, porcelain, and glass. As we have seen, the Templars were licensed to export their own wool. So active was Templar trade with the civilian shipowners of Marseille, as early as 1234, sought to ban the order from their port. Okay. From this date on, both the Templars and the Hospitallers were restricted to one ship each, which could make only 2 voyages a year. They could carry as much cargo as they could hold, but no more than 1,500 passengers. Such measures, however, did not curb the maritime activities of either order. Both simply availed themselves of other ports. On the whole, the Templar fleet was geared toward operations in the Mediterranean, keeping the Holy Land supplied with men and equipment, and importing commodities from the Middle East into Europe. At the same time, however, the fleet did operate in the Atlantic. Extensive trade was conducted with the British Isles and very probably with the Baltic cities of the Hanseatic League. Not familiar with that. Thus, Templar preceptories in Europe, especially in England and Ireland, were generally located on the coast or on navigable rivers. The primary Atlantic seaport for the Templars was La Rochelle, which also had good overland communication with Mediterranean ports. Cloth, for example, could be brought from Britain on Templar ships to La Rochelle, transported overland to the Mediterranean port, such as Collier, I don't know, Collioure. I don't know how to pronounce that. Sorry. Then loaded aboard Templar ships again and carried to the Holy Land. By this means, it was possible to avoid the always risky passage through the Straits of Gibraltar, usually controlled by the Saracens. The personnel of the Paris Temple, who eluded Philippe's grasp, are unlikely to have escaped by land, for the king's men had the region around Paris fairly well patrolled. 2 Templars who did try to flee northwards were captured at Chaumont on the upper Marne, just as they were about to leave French territory. An overland journey all the way to the coast at La Rochelle would have been inordinately difficult, if not impossible. But while the primary Templar port may have been La Rochelle, the order is known to have maintained a fleet of smaller ships on the Seine, and there were in fact a number of Templar houses and preceptories ranging along the river from Paris to the coast, at least 12, including one at Rouen and one near the present site of Le Havre, or Le Havre. Um, Moreover, the Templars were exempt from tolls and their ships were not subject to search. In the months immediately prior to the first arrests, therefore, both personnel and treasure could easily have been transported down the Seine to the coast. Here both men and cargo would have been transferred to larger ships sailing up from La Rochelle or any other port. Even after the arrests and the persecution had begun, the chief escape routes for fleeing Templars were more likely to have been by river and sea than overland. But where, having put out from French coastal ports, would the Templar fleet have gone? It must be remembered that no records of any kind survive, and this in itself is indicative, constituting an important clue in its own right. If Philippe had caught, captured, or impounded Templar ships, there would certainly be some record. Even if official documentation was censored or suppressed, public knowledge would have been widespread. Such a move could not possibly have been kept secret. Similarly, in Spain and Portugal, a Templar landing could not have passed unnoticed. Granted, Templars sailing from France would have been welcomed by the Spanish and Portuguese brethren. They could have expected a cordial reception in such places as Majorca, where the order owned the town and port of Palencia, as well as much other territory, and where the king, Jamie, I don't know how to pronounce it, Jaime, I don't know, Jaime the second, um, was friendly to them. But the seaports of Spain and Portugal were major urban and commercial centers at the time, with a thriving business life and a large civilian population. Amidst the sensation caused by the initial arrests in France, it defies credibility that Templar ships could have put in to some such towns as, say, Palma, and left no trace whatever on the historical record. And the Templars themselves, of course, could not afford to attract such attention. There would in effect have been only three possible destinations for the Templar fleet. One sometimes suggested by historians would have been somewhere in the Islamic world, either in the Mediterranean or on the Atlantic coast of North Africa. But circumstances argue against this. In the first place, the Templars in 1307 still hoped to prove themselves innocent of the charges leveled against them. To seek refuge among the infidels would have been tantamount to admitting the accusations of heresy and disloyalty. Moreover, it is again unlikely, if the Templar fleet found a haven under Islam, that Muslim commentators would have left no record. It would, after all, have been a major propaganda coup. Indeed, when small enclaves of Templars in Spain and Egypt did seek refuge there and converted, at least nominally, to Islam, Muslim writers made considerable capital on it. They would hardly have remained silent had the Templar fleet, as well perhaps as the order's treasure, passed into their camp. It is sometimes suggested that the Templar fleet might have sought safety in Scandinavia. As we have noted, the two Templars interrogated in Scotland claimed that their brethren escaped by sea, and this had led some historians to assume they went to Denmark, Sweden, or most likely, Norway. Such a possibility cannot be altogether discounted, but it is highly improbable. Scandinavia's population was minuscule at the time, and it would have been difficult to escape notice in any inhabited area. The Templars had no preceptories there, no base from which to operate, no ties, commercial or political, with either people or governments, and after the order was officially dissolved in 1310, They would have been as liable to arrest and persecution in Scandinavia as elsewhere. Again, too, one would expect there to be some record. Nevertheless, the fastnesses of the Norse wilderness, no worse after all than the regions colonized by the Teutonic Knights, would have provided a refuge of sorts. It might even have appeared attractive if there had been no alternative. But there was an alternative. There was Scotland, a country with whom the Templars already maintained cordial relations, a country whose acknowledged king had been excommunicated, and, what's more, a country crying out for allies, especially trained fighting men. Had the knights sought to devise or contrive an ideal refuge of their own, they could not possibly have done better than Scotland. Edward's fleet, based on the east coast of England, effectively blocked the established trade routes between Flanders and Scottish ports such as Aberdeen and Inverness. Templar ships moving northwards from La Rochelle or from the mouth of the Seine could not have risked negotiating the Channel and the North Sea. Neither could they have proceeded through the Irish Sea, which was also effectively blocked by the English naval vessels based at Ayr and at Carrickfergus in Belfast Lough. But one important route was open. From the north coast of Ireland, including the mouth of the Foyle at Londonderry, to Bruce's domain in Argyll, Kintyre, and the Sound of Jura. Bruce's close friend and ally, Angus Og MacDonald of Ely, held Ely, Jura, and Colonsay, which secured a direct route between northwestern Ulster and southwestern Scotland. This was the route which for some time had been supplying Bruce with arms and equipment. If large contingents of Templars from the continent and or parts of the Templar fleet itself found refuge in Scotland, they can only have done so by this route. From Donegal, from the Foyle, from the northwest coast of Ulster to the Sound of Jura and its environs. But how could a Templar fleet obtain access to this route without negotiating the Irish Sea and risking interception by English ships? We tend today to think of Ireland as one of the British Isles, whose primary center is Dublin and whose main port, except for one or two in the south, are on the east coast, facing the Irish Sea and the British mainland. This certainly has been the case since the 17th century, but it was not so in the Middle Ages and before. In Bruce's time, Ireland's primary commerce was not with England, but with the continent. In consequence, Dublin and other such eastern ports were insignificant compared to the major southern harbors in the counties of Wexford, Waterford, and Cork. More important still, the west of Ireland, now seen as a remote, denuded, and depopulated hinterland, contained at least two ports of genuinely major proportions, Limerick and, most crucial of all, Galway. Limerick and Galway were thriving cities during the Middle Ages, maintaining a booming trade not only with France but with Spain and North Africa as well. Indeed, some old maps depict Ireland as laying closer to Spain than to England. The trade routes running to Galway from Spain and from such French coastal centers as Bordeaux and La Rochelle were as busy and well established as any of the period. From Galway to the route continued northwards around the coast of Donegal, past the mouth of the Foyle and what today is Londonderry, to the west coast of Scotland. This almost certainly would have been the route taken by any escaping Templar ships. It was a safe, convenient, and familiar route, and the English fleet had no way of cutting it. As we have noted, modern sites in the British Isles bearing the prefix Temple are recognized by historians as having formerly been Templar property. As we have also noted, the Templars, given their considerable maritime and commercial activity, tended to build their major installations on the coast or on navigable rivers. Thus, for example, Mariculter in Scotland was on the Dee Ballantradoch, and Temple Liston were on the Firth of Forth. In England, Temple Thornton was on the Tyne, Westerdale on the Esk, Flaxfleet on the Humber, and there were extensive port facilities at London, Dover, and Bristol. Irish records are decidedly more sketchy, many of them undoubtedly having been lost or destroyed in the upheavals of the ensuing centuries. And in the west of Ireland, where much of the population spoke Gaelic until the 20th century, the kind of documentation found elsewhere may never have been compiled. Such records as do exist for Ireland display a pattern similar to the kind prevailing elsewhere in the British Isles, with Templar preceptories and installations being sited on the coast or on navigable rivers, but these records show the concentration of Templar holdings to have been along the east coast, from Ulster to the main base of Clontarf at Dublin, down through Kilclogan and Temple Bryan to Cork. The primary known exception is Limerick, where the order also had substantial holdings. Looks like we've got another picture coming up. What of the West? Nothing is ever said about it because no one appears to know anything about it. We, however, discovered no fewer than 7 additional sites on the northwest coast of Ireland, which are not mentioned in any charter, but which, on the basis of all available evidence, do appear to have been Templar. In modern-day Donegal, there is a Temple Crone near the Isle of Arran and Temple Cavan on the Malin Peninsula. There is Temple Moyle near Greencastle on the Foyle. Slightly inland from Donegal Bay are Temple House, Temple Rushen, and Temple Cairn. Further inland still, there is Temple Douglas, and there may have been an installation of the order at Lifford in what today is County Tyrone, just north of Strabane. None of these sites appear to have had any particular religious significance, either Christian or pre-Christian, which might explain the temple prefix. At most of them, there are ruined chapels of medieval date. Everything indicates that they too were formerly temple holdings. They would not have appeared in the records because they were so isolated from what were then, and in many cases still are, major population centers. Indeed, the ecclesiastical and secular authorities of the time, the Pope in Avignon, Philippe in Paris, and Edward in London, may not even have known of their existence, and yet they would have conformed to the established Templar pattern of building. They would have provided valuable ports of call, and they would have guarded the trade routes. From all this, it would appear that the Templar fleet, escaping the clutches of the French king, would most likely have made its way up the west and round the north coast of Ireland. Very possibly it made a number of landfalls en route to pick up arms, equipment, and perhaps other fugitive brethren. Once having reached the vicinity of the Foyle, the refugees would have been safe in territory held by Bruce's allies, and from the Foyle and the coast of western Ulster there would have been a direct connection with the established route whereby arms were smuggled to Argyll under the auspices and protection of Angus Og MacDonald. Thus Templar ships, Templar arms and material, Templar fighting men, and just possibly the Templar treasure would have found their way to Scotland, providing vital reinforcements and resources for Bruce's cause. Okay, so we have a map here. So there's the map itself and then a blown up portion um, of Scotland and the northern Irish coast. I don't know how much of it you'll be able to read, but I'll scan it from bottom to top as fairly slowly. Okay. Possible Templar routes, safe sea route into Scotland, 1307 through 9. There we go. Yeah, you can read that all pretty well. English fleet based at Ayr. Okay, and then there's the blown up section. And what does that say? Areas patrolled by English and pro-English forces are those hashed out areas in the oceans. There you go. All right, so moving on. Legends of Temple survival. Writing in the mid-19th century, one historian of the Templars states, perhaps a trifle more definitively than can be justified, quote, "Many Templars, however, were still at large, having successfully evaded capture by obliterating all marks of their previous profession, and some had escaped in disguise to the wild and mountainous parts of Wales, Scotland, and Ireland." End quote. At the end of the century, another historian writes, quote, "The Templars perhaps found a refuge in the little army of the excommunicated King Robert, whose fear of offending the French monarch would doubtless be vanquished by his desire to secure a few capable men-at-arms as recruits." End quote. And a modern historian writing in 1972 is even more precise. Quote, "All but 2 Scottish brethren escaped. Shrewd politicians, they may well have found refuge with the Bruce's guerrillas. Certainly King Robert never legally ratified the Scottish Temple's dissolution." End quote. Masonic historians and Masonically oriented writers are more explicit still and more precise in their claims. Thus, quote, "We are told that having deserted the Temple, they ranged themselves under the banners of Robert Bruce and fought with him at Bannockburn. Legend states that after the decisive battle of Bannockburn, Bruce, in return for their eminent services, formed these Templars into a new body." End quote. And again, quote, "In 1309, when persecutions began, an inquisition was held at Holyrood. Only 2 knights appeared, and others were legitimately occupied in the fighting, having joined Bruce's army, which was marching against the English." End quote. Whether such statements as latter two, issuing as they do from Masonic sources, are drawing on verifiable information as well as legend is uncertain. In any case, there is no question that legends of a Templar survival in Scotland abound. In fact, there are at least 2 distinct bodies of legend. One of these was first promulgated, or at least first broke the surface of history, through the activities of an important 18th century Freemason, Baron Karl von Hund, and the Masonic rite deriving from him, a rite known as the Strict Observance, which purported to be a restoration of the Order of the Temple according to the Strict Observance. Pierre de Mont, preceptor of Auvergne, together with 7 knights and 2 other preceptors, fled France around 1310, escaping first to Ireland and then 2 years later to Scotland, more specifically to the island of Mull. On Mull, they are said to have joined forces with a number of other Templars, presumably refugees from England and Scotland, led by a preceptor whose name is cited as George Harris, formerly an officer of the Order of Caburn, and Hampton Court, and under the joint auspices of Harris and Pierre de Mont. a resolution was made to perpetuate the institution. A list of Templar Grand Masters, which Baron von Hund produced, shows Pierre de Monts succeeding Jacques de Molay. In Part 3 of this book, we will examine in detail the plausibility of these assertions, as well as the specific historical context from which they arose and which they must be placed. We will assess Hund's own credibility and that of the sources from which he claimed to have obtained his information. For the moment, it will be sufficient simply to comment on some of the details in the strict observance account. In certain respects, at any rate, the details are not just unreliable, but demonstrably wrong. For example, the strict observance declares Pierre de Monts to have been preceptor of Auvergne. In fact, however, the preceptor of Auvergne was not Pierre de Monts, but Imbert Blanc, who, as we have seen, fled to England in 1306 and got himself arrested. Moreover, it is most improbable that refugee Templars could have found a haven on the island of Mull. Mull at the time was owned and occupied by Alexander MacDougall of Lorne, one of Edward II's allies and Bruce's fiercest adversaries. Even after Bruce defeated him, he would have had numerous sympathizers on Mull who would have been reticent about clandestine Templar activity on the island. On the other hand, there were two sites owned by Bruce's allies where fugitive Templars could indeed have found a refuge, or at any rate a safe way station on their travels. One of these provided a brief refuge for Bruce himself during adverse phases of his campaigns, and contained a strongly garrisoned castle which remained unswervingly loyal to him. And both sites were strategically situated on the crucial maritime route between Ulster and Bruce's supply bases in Argyll. These sites were the Mull of Kintyre and the Mull of Oa. I guess that's Oa. It's O-A. The strict observance account may thus be erroneous in some of its particulars, but it is easy to see how such misconceptions could have occurred. On his own admission, Hund heard his account from Scottish informants. Details could well have been garbled in the course of some 4.5 centuries. They would almost certainly have been garbled further by transmission and translation. If a modern Englishman can confuse the island of Mull with the Mull of Kintyre or the Mull of Oa, such confusion is all the more understandable on the part of an 18th century German nobleman who's knowing nothing of Scottish geography and confronted by a welter of data not even in his own tongue. While the strict observance account, therefore, may indeed be mistaken in particulars, its general tenor is eminently plausible. One especially telling detail is the assertion that the fugitive Templars went first to Ireland. This, as we have seen, rings emphatically true, and there would have been no need to include it in a fabricated story. The second legend of the Templar survival first appeared in France around 1804, more than half a century after Hund. Under the Napoleonic regime, an individual named Bernard Raymond Fabre Palaprat produced a charter purporting to date from 1324, 10 years after the execution of Jacques de Molay. If this charter is to be believed, Jacques, shortly before his death, left instructions for the perpetuation of the order. To succeed him as Grand Master, the supposedly nominated one of the Templars left behind on Cyprus, a Palestinian-born Christian named John Mark Larmenius. On the basis of the so-called Larmenius Charter, Fabre Palaprat created or made public a non-Masonic, neo-chivalric institution, the ancient and sovereign military order of the Temple of Jerusalem, which is still in existence today. According to unconfirmed statements by its present members, the Larmenius Charter, though first made public in 1804, was already in circulation a century before, in 1705, and Fabre Palaprat's order is said to date its reconstitution from then. We ourselves cannot confirm or refute the veracity of the Larmenius Charter. For our purposes, it is of interest primarily because of one statement it contains. Quote, I lastly will say and order that the Scot Templars, deserters of the order, be blasted by an anathema. End quote. This single fulmination is interesting indeed provocative, and perhaps revealing. If the Larmenius Charter is authentic and does in fact date from the 14th century, the fulmination would seem to confirm the survival of Templar fugitives in Scotland. It suggests further that these fugitives adopted a position opposed to Larmenius and his entourage, who, one gathers, sought exoneration from all charges and some species of reconciliation with the Church. But if, as is more likely, the Larmenius Charter dates from later, from the 18th or 19th century, it suggests some violent antipathy to the assertions promulgated by Hund and strict observance Masonry, or to some other known Templar institution surviving in Scotland at that time. Whatever the validity of the legends, there is, as we have seen, no question that at least some Templars found their way to Scotland, while others already in the country were never caught. The only real question is how many remained at large. Ultimately, however, even the precise numbers do not matter. The point is that the Templars, however numerous or few they may have been, were trained fighting men, the best fighting men of their age, the acknowledged masters of warfare. Scotland was a kingdom desperately struggling for her independence, for the survival of her nation and cultural identity. What was more, she lay under papal interdict, and her king was excommunicated. In such circumstances, Bruce would obviously have welcomed whatever help he could get, and such help as the Templars could offer would have been more than welcome. As seasoned veterans, they would have been invaluable in training the Scottish soldiery, in inculcating discipline, in imparting professionalism to men pitted against a numerically superior and better equipped foe. Their expertise in broader strategic and strategy and logistics would have been vital. Whether they actually comprised the fresh force that intervened so decisively at Bannockburn will probably never be known, but they need not actually have comprised it. A handful of them would have been sufficient to lead it, and it would still have produced the effect it did on the English army. And that is the end of the chapter. That leads us to Chapter 5, Celtic Scotland and the Grail Legends. Haha! The Grail Legends. Nice. So that's where we'll pick up on Thursday. Excuse me. So, yeah. I am going to go ahead and take a break, end this session. Come back in a little bit to play some We Happy Few. But first, it's dinner time. So I will be back when I'm done eating. So I will see you all in a little bit.